A millionaire was walking down the street when a man forced him into a black van. Days later, the man was shocked when he looked at himself in the mirror. Thomas Holloway was walking distractedly down the busy street, his expensive suit contrasting with the hustle and bustle around him. His blue eyes, usually focused on business details, now wandered, lost in thoughts about his latest million-dollar project. The city's buzz seemed distant, as if he were in his own bubble. As he passed a newsstand, his gaze caught a headline about the stock market, making him hesitate for a moment. Perhaps maybe it's time to diversify investments. You never know when the wind might change, Thomas murmured to himself, his voice almost drowned out by the city's noise. Suddenly, a black van screeched to a stop beside him, the side door sliding open with a metallic crash. Two masked men jumped out, grabbing Thomas by the arms before he could process what was happening. The millionaire, caught by surprise, tried to break free, his briefcase falling to the ground and scattering important papers across the asphalt. His heart raced, adrenaline flooding his system as he struggled against the attackers. Let me go, you don't know who you're dealing with. I'm Thomas Holloway, I can pay you whatever you want, Thomas shouted, his voice blending with the sound of car horns and the cries of shocked pedestrians. The kidnappers, efficient and determined, ignored his protests. One of them, with cold eyes visible through the mask, pressed something against Thomas's back, the unmistakable feel of a gun barrel. The other thug, more muscular, practically lifted Thomas off the ground, dragging him into the van. In a final act of desperation, Thomas clung to the side of the door, his fingers leaving marks on the shiny black paint. Someone call the police. These men are kidnapping me. Help! Thomas yelled, frantically looking at the astonished faces of the passers-by. Inside the van, the smell of new leather mixed with the metallic scent of fear invaded his nostrils. Thomas struggled, trying to free himself from the hands that held him tightly. His mind raced, trying to understand the reason behind all this. Was it a regular kidnapping, revenge from a competitor, or something more sinister? The van sped up, plunging into the chaotic city traffic. Thomas was thrown against the metal floor, the impact reverberating through his body. You don't know what you're getting into. Whoever is behind this, I can offer double, triple, whatever you want, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear consuming him. The van continued its escape, zigzagging between cars with frightening skill. Thomas, still struggling against his captors, caught a glimpse through the front window as the familiar streets of the city blurred before they shut the window to prevent him from seeing where they were going. The reality of his situation began to sink in. He was being taken far away from everything he knew, from everything he had built. And for the first time in many years, Thomas Holloway, the powerful millionaire, felt completely powerless. He could only sit there terrified, nervously counting the seconds, hoping he would get out of this situation alive. A while later, the van came to a sudden stop, throwing Thomas against the front seat. Before he could recover, a blindfold was placed over his eyes and his hands were tied. The millionaire felt himself being dragged out of the vehicle, his feet stumbling over uneven ground. The fresh air hit his face, but the relief was short-lived. He was pushed into a building, the echo of his footsteps indicating a large, empty space. After what seemed like an eternity, Thomas was thrown into a cold, metallic chair. You have no idea the mistake you're making. When I get out of here, I'll make sure every one of you spends the rest of your lives behind bars, Thomas growled, trying to keep his composure. The sound of footsteps fading away was the only response he received. Thomas struggled against his restraints, the metal cutting into his wrists. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his ragged breathing and the occasional hum of electronic equipment. The hours dragged on, marked only by his growing thirst and discomfort. Eventually, exhausted, Thomas fell into a restless sleep. He woke with a start, disoriented by the total darkness. The blindfold had been removed, but the lack of light was equally disorienting. Thomas blinked repeatedly, trying to adjust his vision. Gradually, shapes began to materialize in the dim light. Silhouettes of medical equipment surrounded him, their standby lights blinking like vigilant eyes in the darkness. "What do you want from me? Who are you all?" "Why are you doing this?" he asked. A sudden noise to his right made Thomas turn his head sharply. Soft footsteps were approaching, and he could feel a presence moving around him. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He tried to free himself again, the metal cuffs biting into his flesh, but it was useless. The footsteps stopped right behind him, and Thomas held his breath, anticipating the worst. "Who are you? Show your face, you coward," Thomas demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. A bright, sudden light momentarily blinded Thomas. Blinking to clear the spots from his vision, he finally saw his captor. A tall man dressed in a white lab coat stood before him. His face was hidden behind a surgical mask, but his eyes were cold and calculating. The man approached, holding a syringe. "Don't worry, Mr. Holloway. Soon everything will become clear," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Thomas struggled violently, the chair creaking under his frantic movements. "Say no, stay away from me. What are you going to do?" The mysterious man ignored his protests, moving closer with the syringe. With a quick and precise motion, he injected the contents into Thomas's arm. The effect was almost immediate. Thomas felt his eyelids grow heavy, his vision blurring. He fought to stay conscious, but it was a losing battle. Why are you doing this?" Thomas murmured, his voice already slurred by the sedative. The last images Thomas registered before succumbing to the darkness were of the man walking away and picking up something from a nearby tray. A surgical mask. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. His world spun, and then finally, he lost consciousness, leaving him at the mercy of his mysterious captor and whatever fate awaited him. Consciousness returned to Thomas like waves crashing on the shore, each one bringing fragments of sensations. The smell of mold and cheap cigarette smoke invaded his nostrils, fully awakening him. His eyes opened, blinking rapidly to adjust to the dim light filtering through faded curtains. He found himself lying on a narrow bed, the rough sheets scratching his skin. His head throbbed, and a wave of nausea overtook him. Thomas tried to sit up, his muscles protesting with every movement. Where am I? What happened to me?" Thomas murmured, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable to his own ears. He looked around, taking in the details of the rundown room. Peeling wallpaper, an old television on a shaky stand, and a single window covered by curtains that had seen better days. This was certainly not the kind of place where Thomas Holloway, the millionaire, would normally stay. His eyes caught a reflection in the mirror hanging on the opposite wall. Something was wrong, very wrong. Thomas stood up shakily, his legs trembling under his weight. He leaned against the wall, dragging himself toward the door of the room, but something caught his attention. A mirror. As Thomas approached the door and saw his reflection, the shock hit him like a punch to the stomach. The face staring back at him was not his own. Where once there had been an oval face with aristocratic features, Thomas now faced completely different traits. The nose, once straight and narrow, was now broader and slightly upturned. His thin lips had been replaced by a fuller, more angular mouth. The highly pronounced cheekbones were now fuller, giving him a more youthful appearance. The jawline, previously square and defined, was now more rounded. Dark, thick hair replaced his thinning grey strands, and a shadow of stubble darkened the chin that was once always clean-shaven. Thomas touched his face in disbelief, watching the reflection mimic his movements. His blue eyes, the only feature that remained unchanged, stared back at him with a mix of shock and dread. Panic began to rise in his throat. "No, no, no! What have they done to me? This can't be real," Thomas screamed, his new face contorted in an expression of horror. He staggered back, tripping over the bed and falling into a sitting position. His mind was spinning, trying to process the impossible. Fragmented memories of the captivity, of the mysterious man with the syringe, began to fit together. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat, barely making it to the bathroom in time. After a few agonizing minutes hunched over the toilet, he dragged himself back to the bedroom, his legs still unsteady. "Think, Thomas, think. Who would do this?" "Why?" he murmured, pressing his palms against his temples. Before he could form any theory, a loud noise startled him. Someone was pounding on the door, hard enough to make the hinges shake. Thomas froze, his heart racing in his chest. The pounding came again, more insistent this time. "We know you're in there. Open up now, or we'll break down this door." A rough male voice shouted from the other side of the door. Thomas looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. The window seemed to be the only option, but they were at least on the 3rd floor. He found himself trapped between the terror of the unknown beyond the door and the danger of a potentially fatal fall. Who are you?" "What do you want with me?" Thomas shouted back, his new voice sounding strange to his ears. The answer came in the form of a deafening crash as the door gave way under the brute force of the intruders. Thomas didn't wait to see who was coming in. In one swift motion, he ran to the window. With trembling fingers, he fought against the rusty lock, finally managing to open it. The cold night air hit him, momentarily paralyzing him. Here he's escaping through the window. "Quick, get him before he gets away," a hoarse voice yelled behind him. Thomas climbed down the fire escape and looked up, seeing silhouettes crowding the window of his former room. He quickened his descent, the stairs creaking dangerously under his bare feet. The cold night wind whipped his face, cruelly reminding him of his vulnerability in just a thin robe. "Damn, they're getting too close. I need to get off this fire escape now," Thomas murmured to himself, his new voice still strange to his ears. Reaching the second floor, Thomas saw a window slightly ajar. Without a second thought, he dove inside, rolling onto a worn and dusty carpet. He quickly got up, ignoring the pain in his muscles, and ran down the dimly lit hallway. Where did he go? Spread out. He must have entered somewhere on this floor. Thomas heard one of the pursuers shout, the voice echoing down the fire escape. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but Thomas forced himself to stay focused. He ran down the hallway, testing each doorknob he encountered. Locked, he muttered, cursing at each door he couldn't open. Then, miraculously, a door yielded under his hand. Without hesitation, he slipped into the dark room, closing the door silently behind him. "Oh my God," a female voice gasped, and Thomas turned to see a middle-aged woman sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with fear. Before she could scream, Thomas put a finger to his lips, silently begging for her cooperation. His desperate, pleading eyes met hers. For a tense moment, the only sound in the room was their heavy breathing. "Please, I won't hurt you." "I just need to hide for a few minutes," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman, still in shock, slowly nodded. Thomas moved to the darkest corner of the room, crouching behind a worn armchair. His heart was pounding so hard that he feared it might be heard from the hallway. The sounds of footsteps and voices grew louder, passing by the room's door and continuing down the corridor. Harry must have gone down. "Come on, to the street," a rough voice shouted, followed by the sound of several people running down the stairs. Thomas remained still, counting the seconds in his mind. The woman in the room didn't move, her eyes fixed on him with a mix of fear and curiosity. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the pursuit faded, indicating that the men had left the hotel. "Thank you. I'm sorry for the trouble. I promise you won't see me again," Thomas murmured to the woman, slowly standing up. He approached the window, cautiously peering down at the street below. He saw his pursuers spreading out, searching for him nearby. Thomas knew he needed to act quickly. "I'll wait a few more minutes and then leave. I need to get to a safe place and figure out what's happening to me," Thomas thought, his mind racing to plan his next move. Thomas waited a few more minutes, his eyes fixed on the street below, watching his pursuers gradually move away. When he finally judged it safe, he turned to the woman in the room, who remained silent, watching him with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Oh, thank you again. You have no idea how much you've helped me." "Is there a back exit in this hotel?" Thomas asked, his voice low and serious. The woman hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, there's a service staircase at the end of the hallway to the left. It leads directly to the back street," she replied, her voice shaking with fear. Thomas nodded in thanks and, after checking the hallway, quickly left the room. Following the woman's instructions, he found the service staircase and quietly descended, his bare feet barely making a sound on the metal steps. When he reached the street, Thomas found himself in a narrow, dimly lit alley. "And I need to get to the police station. It's the only place where I can try to explain what happened and get help," he murmured to himself, looking both ways down the alley. Thomas began to walk quickly, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main streets. His heart was still racing, and every sudden sound made him jump. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few blocks, he spotted the facade of the police station. Taking a deep breath to calm his nerves, Thomas entered the building. The interior was brightly lit compared to the darkness outside, and he blinked several times to adjust his vision. An officer sitting behind a counter looked at him with suspicion. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone more suspicious than helpful. Thomas approached the counter, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, please." "My name is Thomas Holloway, and I need to report a crime. I was kidnapped and, well, this is going to sound unbelievable, but someone surgically altered my face, and I don't know what's happening. I woke up in a hotel room with men chasing me, but I don't know who they are." He tried to explain, fully aware of how absurd it sounded, something he would have found unbelievable himself until it happened to him. The officer frowned, his expression shifting from suspicion to disbelief. "Sir, this is a police station, not a movie set. If this is some kind of joke—" "No, it's not a joke. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth. I'm Thomas Holloway, the businessman. I was kidnapped days ago and woke up with a different face. I need help." Thomas interrupted, his voice rising in depth. The buzz in the station quieted, and Thomas noticed that several other officers were now watching him with interest. One of them, a middle-aged detective with a sharp gaze, approached the counter. "Sir, calm down. Why don't you come with me so we can talk privately?" the detective said, his voice calm but firm. However, Thomas could tell from the man's tone that he thought he was dealing with a crazy person. Thomas followed the detective into an interrogation room, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and apprehension. Maybe now someone would finally listen to him. The detective closed the door and gestured for Thomas to sit down. "By now, why don't you tell me this story from the beginning?" the detective asked, sitting down across from him. Thomas took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the past few days, the kidnapping, waking up with a new face, escaping from the hotel. But before he could finish his account, the door to the interrogation room abruptly opened. A second detective entered, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw Thomas. "My God, Johnson. I didn't believe it when I saw him from a distance. How did Hank end up here?" the newcomer exclaimed, addressing the first detective, who looked shocked. What do you mean?" the first detective asked. "First, you didn't recognize him. He's Hank, the criminal." The detective quickly turned to Thomas, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. He walked swiftly to a bulletin board on the wall, tore off a wanted poster, and placed it on the table in front of Thomas. The face on the poster was identical to the one Thomas now saw in the mirror. "As this is Hank Morrison, a criminal wanted for large-scale fraud," Johnson explained, his voice now firm. "And you just walked in here telling an absurd story about identity theft and facial surgery," he said. The blood in Thomas's veins ran cold. "No, you don't understand. I'm not this Hank." "I'm the victim here," he responded, terrified. The two detectives exchanged significant looks. Johnson made a subtle move toward the door, likely to call for backup. In a moment of pure panic and survival instinct, Thomas abruptly stood up, knocking over the chair. "I'm sorry, but I can't be arrested for a crime I didn't commit," he said, his voice trembling. With a quick motion, Thomas shoved the two detectives, catching them by surprise, and ran out of the interrogation room. Chaos erupted in the station as he dodged officers and knocked over objects in his path to the exit. "Stop! Police!" voices shouted behind him, but Thomas didn't dare look back. He burst through the front door of the station, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. The sound of gunshots began to ring out behind him, and Thomas did his best to protect himself as he ran blindly down the street. Then he found an alley, his heart threatening to explode in his chest. Thomas sprinted through the dark alley, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of his chest. The sound of distant sirens made him quicken his pace even more, his bare feet painfully striking the cold, rough asphalt. He turned one corner, then another, not really knowing where he was going, only knowing that he needed to get as far away from the station as possible. "Think, Thomas, think. Where can I go? Who will believe me?" he muttered to himself, breathless. Then, like a beacon in the darkness, a thought surfaced in his confused mind. Nancy, his wife. Of course, she knew him better than anyone. If there was anyone who could see through this strange face and recognize the real Thomas, it would be her. With a goal in mind, Thomas began to orient himself, gradually recognizing the streets of the city he knew so well. The Holloway mansion was a few miles away, in the exclusive suburbs of the city. Thomas knew he couldn't risk taking a taxi or any public transportation. His face, or rather Hank's face, would be all over the news by now. He would have to go on foot, hiding in the shadows and avoiding the security cameras that dotted the city. The journey was long and tense. Every passing police car made Thomas shrink back into the shadows, his heart nearly stopping. Twice he had to hide in dark alleys when pedestrians got too close. All the while, his mind spun with unanswered questions. How could this happen? Who would do this to me? And why? Thomas thought as exhaustion and fear battled for control of his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas spotted the familiar gates of his property. The mansion loomed against the night sky, its windows lit like beacons of hope. Thomas hesitated for a moment, aware of his appearance barefoot, with the face of a wanted criminal. But he had no choice. He needed help, and Nancy was his last hope. With his heart in his throat, Thomas approached the intercom by the gate. His hands trembled as he pressed the button, and he had to force himself to keep his voice steady as he spoke. Nancy, it's me, Thomas. Please, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." There was a moment of silence, and then Nancy's voice came through the intercom, a mix of confusion and concern. "Thomas, I can't believe it. Thank God. I've been worried. You haven't shown up for days. We called the police, but nothing happened." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. She recognized his voice. "Yes, Nancy, it's me. I know this is going to sound crazy, but something terrible has happened. Please, let me in and I'll explain everything." There was another brief silence, and then Nancy replied, her voice now tinged with anxiety. "Of course, dear. I'm opening the gate." There was another long silence, and then the gate began to slowly open. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of tension as he saw two security guards approaching, their hands resting threateningly on their weapons. Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, walking slowly towards the house. He could see Nancy standing at the front door, her face a mask of fear and confusion. As he got closer, he began to speak quickly, desperate to make her understand. "Nancy, I know I don't look like myself, but I swear I'm Thomas. I was kidnapped. They did something to my face. I woke up looking like this. Please, you have to believe me." Nancy took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay where you are. I don't know who you are, but you're not my husband. How dare you do this? Knowing we're worried, playing with me like this. You even try to imitate my husband's voice. Get out of my house now," she screamed, her voice trembling. Before Thomas could respond, one of the security guards stepped forward, his gun now aimed directly at Thomas's chest. The man looked at him, and his eyes widened in recognition. "My God, it's Hank Morrison, the wanted criminal. Don't move or I'll shoot," the guard muttered, his voice a mix of fear and determination. Thomas froze, his world crumbling around him. He looked at Nancy, silently begging for help, but saw only fear and disgust in her eyes. The barrel of the guard's gun gleamed under the porch light, a silent promise that the situation could get much worse in a matter of seconds. "Nancy, please, look into my eyes. You have to recognize me. It's me, Thomas, your husband," Thomas whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Nancy hesitated, her eyes darting between Thomas and the armed guard. The tension in the air was palpable, and Thomas knew he had only seconds to act. His wife wasn't going to believe him. The story was too absurd to seem real. So, seizing the moment of indecision, he abruptly turned and ran towards the back of the property. The sound of a gunshot sliced through the air, followed by Nancy's scream. "Don't shoot!" "Let's call the police to find out what's going on," she shouted, her voice a mixture of fear and confusion. Thomas didn't dare look back, focusing only on getting away. He vaulted over the back fence with an agility he didn't know he possessed, ignoring the pain as thorns tore at his skin. The suburban streets stretched out before him, quiet and dark. The distant sound of sirens spurred him to run even faster, his heart pounding against his ribs. After running for several blocks, Thomas spotted the neon sign of a 24-hour convenience store. It was risky, but he needed a place to hide and think. Slowing his pace to avoid drawing attention, he entered the store, trying to appear as casual as possible, despite being barefoot and wearing wrinkled, dirty clothes. The sleepy clerk barely glanced at him as Thomas headed to the back of the store, where there was a public computer. With trembling fingers, He accessed his bank's website, desperately hoping he could get into his accounts and get some money to escape. Come on, Thomas murmured, typing in his password. Please work. To his dismay, the screen flashed with an error message, account not found. Thomas tried again and again, each failed attempt increasing his panic. After the fifth attempt, a new message appeared. Access blocked for security reasons. Please contact your account manager. Thomas felt like he had been punched in the stomach. What did Nancy say about my disappearance? According to her, I was missing for at least several days. They must have blocked the account. But now what do I do? Thomas whispered, incredulous. As Thomas stared at the screen in shock, a man entered the store. The newcomer walked over to the drink cooler, but his eyes kept darting back to Thomas. Suddenly, the man stopped, his eyes widening in recognition. Thomas noticed the look and felt his heart start to race. He tried to act normal, pretending to be engrossed in the computer, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man discreetly take out his phone and start dialing a number. Damn, he recognized me. I need to get out of here now, Thomas thought, panic rising in his chest. Standing up abruptly, Thomas walked quickly towards the exit. The clerk, now more alert, looked at him suspiciously. Thomas could hear the man behind him speaking quietly on the phone. Yes, police. I think I just saw the fugitive Hank Morrison at the convenience store on. Thomas didn't wait to hear the rest. He bolted out of the store, the doorbell jangling violently behind him. The cold night air hit him again, but he barely felt it, focused only on getting away as fast as possible. Where to now? No money, no ID, and everyone is hunting me. How am I going to prove who I am? Thomas thought frantically, running down the dark street. The sirens began to wail in the distance, closing in quickly. Thomas turned down an alley, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. At some point, he would have to face the truth and find a way to prove his identity. But for now, all he could do was run and hope a solution would appear before it was too late. Thomas ran through the dark streets, his heart pounding frantically against his ribs. The sound of sirens grew closer, echoing through the empty streets in the early morning. He turned one corner, then another, trying to lose his pursuers. That's when his eyes caught something. A large city map posted at a bus stop. Thomas stopped abruptly, gasping for breath, his eyes quickly scanning the lines and contours of the map. Think, Thomas, think! I was near this newsstand when they took me. Where could they have taken me? How long was I in that van? He murmured to himself, trying to steady his breathing. Forcing his mind to return to that terrible moment, Thomas closed his eyes, trying to recall every detail. The van, the smell of new leather, the sway of the turns, and the time. Yes, the time. He remembered counting the minutes, a nervous habit that now might save him. It was about 30 minutes of driving before they reached the place where they kept me, Thomas whispered, his eyes snapping open. With trembling hands, Thomas traced an imaginary circle on the map, mentally calculating the distance the van could have traveled in half an hour. His eyes locked onto a specific area, an abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts of the city. It has to be there. That's the only place where they could have kept me hidden for so long without raising suspicion, Thomas thought, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Without wasting another second, Thomas memorized the route and started running again. The residential streets gave way to wider avenues and gradually to abandoned industrial buildings. The air grew heavier, filled with the smell of metal and old oil. Thomas slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. Till I'm closer, I can feel it. But what will I do when I find the place? How will I prove my story? He murmured, his eyes scanning every shadow, every alley. Thomas moved cautiously, each step calculated to make as little noise as possible. The buildings around him seemed to watch him with their empty, dark windows, like the eyes of a ghost town. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant howl of a dog or the sound of metal creaking in the wind. Turning another corner, Thomas felt his heart leap into his throat. There, discreetly parked between two abandoned warehouses, was a black van, identical to the one that had kidnapped him. Thomas quickly hid behind a rusty container, his heart pounding so hard he feared it could be heard. That's it. That's the van they put me in, I'm sure of it. Thomas thought, his mind racing with possibilities. Heard, but are they still here? Or is this just a cruel coincidence? Gathering all his courage, Thomas stealthily approached the van. Every step felt like an eternity, with fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins in equal measure. As he got close enough, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were fresh tire tracks in the dust, indicating the vehicle had been used recently. Thomas was about to investigate further when a sound made him freeze in place. Voices, male voices approaching. In a panic, he threw himself behind a stack of crates, barely daring to breathe. Two men emerged from one of the nearby warehouses, speaking in low tones. "Are you sure Hank will come today?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Of course," the other replied, sounding annoyingly calm. "The boss said everything's set. It looks like the coast is clear for him to come. The other one must be in custody by now." Thomas felt a mix of fear and anger boiling in his chest. They were talking about him. These were the men responsible for his current situation. He wanted to jump out of his hiding spot, confront them, demand answers, but he knew it would be suicide. So he remained still, absorbing every word, every detail that he could use to prove his story. Desperation. "And what about the doctor?" the first man asked, opening the van door. "Isn't he going to spill the beans?" The second man laughed, a cold sound that made Thomas shiver. Dr. Frank." "No, he's in this as deep as we are. We just need to keep watch until Hank arrives." Thomas remained still for a few seconds after the men entered the warehouse, his brain furiously processing the information he had just heard. Hank, the man whose face he now had, was expected. A crazy and dangerous idea began to form in his mind. If he could pass himself off as Hank, maybe he could get the answers he desperately needed. It was risky, but what choice did he have? It's now or never. You can do this, Thomas. You've negotiated with corporate sharks for years. This is just another bluff, Thomas murmured to himself, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. With determined steps, Thomas emerged from his hiding spot and walked toward the warehouse. Each step seemed to echo in his ears, his heart pounding so hard he feared it could be heard miles away. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, gathering all his courage. "Remember, you're Hank now. Be ruthless, calculated, and in control," Thomas thought, adjusting his posture to appear more confident. With a sharp movement, Thomas opened the warehouse door, entering as if he owned the place. The two men he had seen earlier turned abruptly, surprise evident on their faces. The warehouse was spacious, dimly lit, with boxes and equipment scattered everywhere. Well, well, well," Thomas said, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't feel. "Looks like you were expecting me. I hope everything's in order." The men exchanged quick glances before one of them, the taller one, stepped forward. "Boss, we didn't expect you so soon. We thought you'd come later after—" "Well, you know," Thomas waved dismissively, trying to imitate what he imagined would be the demeanor of a ruthless criminal. "Change of plans. I figured it was better to come personally and make sure you haven't messed everything up," he said. The other man, visibly nervous, stepped closer. "Everything's under control, boss. That other guy should be behind bars by now. No one's going to believe him now." Thomas felt a surge of anger at hearing this, but maintained his composure. He walked around the warehouse, pretending to inspect the boxes and equipment, while his mind worked frantically to understand the situation and keep up the act. "And Dr. Frank, is he cooperating?" Thomas asked casually, remembering the mention of the doctor in the earlier conversation. The taller man laughed. "Don't worry about him, boss. He's as deep in this as we are. He won't say a word. We've already shown him pictures of his family and let him know we know everything about them. The man will keep his mouth shut." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. He was about to ask more questions when one of the men's phones rang, breaking the tension in the air. The man answered quickly, his face growing serious as he listened. "Theos," he said, hanging up and turning to Thomas. "That was about the delivery. Everything's set to go down tonight. What should we do?" Suddenly, all eyes were on Thomas, waiting for his orders. He felt the weight of their expectations, knowing that his next move could make or break his cover. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing to find the right response. "The delivery," Thomas said slowly, buying time to think. "Of course, let's go over the details. I want to make sure nothing goes wrong this time." The men exchanged quick glances before the taller one, whom Thomas mentally nicknamed Big Guy, grabbed a folder from a nearby table. He opened it, revealing maps and documents that Thomas couldn't fully decipher from a distance. While they were distracted, Thomas discreetly pocketed a cell phone that was lying on the table. The man began explaining the details of the operation, and Thomas felt his stomach churn. He was about to get deeply involved in criminal activities, but he had no choice but to keep up the bluff. Thomas looked at the two men, trying to appear confident despite the fear consuming him inside. "So, tell me about this delivery. Where and when is it going to happen?" The taller man, a Big Guy, answered promptly. "At Pier 17, boss." "At midnight. 3 trucks will arrive with the goods." Thomas nodded slowly, as if considering the information. "And how many men do we have on the job?" "6, boss, all armed and ready," said the other man, who was shorter and more nervous. Thomas frowned, guilty, pretending to be dissatisfied. "That's not enough. Double the number. I want 12 men there." Big Guy and Nervous exchanged surprised looks. "But boss, we thought you wanted to keep the operation small," Big Guy began. "I've changed my mind." "Is that a problem?" Thomas responded sharply. The two men quickly shook their heads. "No, boss." "Of course not." Thomas was about to ask more questions when the sound of an approaching car made everyone freeze. Nervous quickly ran to the window and peeked through the dusty curtains. Boss, you need to see this. There's a man who looks exactly like you coming in. It must be the Millionaire, Thomas. I think he's found our location and is about to come in." "What should we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist. Thomas's heart raced. He looked out the window and saw Hank, the real criminal, who now had the same face as him. He knew he had to act fast. "Stay calm. I'll handle this," Thomas ordered, his mind racing. When the warehouse door opened, revealing Hank, everyone fell silent, staring at the two identical men. Hank looked around, confused, until his eyes landed on Thomas. A cold smile spread across Hank's face. Recognition and surprise mixed in his expression. "Well, well, well," Hank said, his voice dripping with malice. Looks like our little experiment worked better than expected." "You look great with my face, Thomas." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm Hank, and you're clearly an imposter." Hank laughed, a sound that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand on end. "Oh, still trying to fool my men with a disguise? Impressive, but the game's up, Thomas," Hank said. Big Guy and Nervous looked at each other, completely lost. "Boss, what's going on here?" Big Guy asked hesitantly. Hank turned to the henchman, his smile never wavering. Let me explain, boys. This man here," he pointed at Thomas, "is Thomas Holloway. Remember the millionaire we turned into a scapegoat? Well, it seems he managed to escape and decided to come play at being me." Thomas felt panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Don't believe him, he's trying to confuse you. I'm the real Hank." The tension in the air was palpable. Big Guy and Nervous looked completely confused, their eyes darting back and forth between Thomas and Hank. "This is ridiculous. Come on, Thomas, the game's over. Do you really think you can fool me?" "I planned all of this, remember?" Hank said, stepping forward. Thomas knew he was losing control of the situation. He had to do something, anything, to convince the henchman that he was the real Hank. "Hey guys, are you really going to believe this imposter? I've been your boss for years." "You know me," Thomas said, turning to Big Guy and Nervous. At that moment, Nervous, with trembling hands, pulled a gun from his holster. "Fair enough. Who's who?" "Who's the real boss?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The gun shook in his hands as he pointed it alternately at Thomas and Hank. Time seemed to freeze. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked at the barrel of the gun, then at Hank, who seemed strangely calm in the situation. Come on, guys. Do you really think I wouldn't have a plan for a situation like this? Lower your weapons and let's talk like civilized people," Hank said, his voice smooth and controlled. Thomas realized that his life depended on the next words that came out of his mouth. He needed to think fast, using every ounce of his wits to get out of this situation alive. "Don't listen to him. I can prove I'm the real Hank. Ask me anything. Something only the real Hank would know," Thomas exclaimed, desperate. The tension in the warehouse was palpable as Big Guy and Nervous continued their questioning. Seizing a moment of distraction, when the two henchmen were arguing about what question to ask next, Thomas discreetly pulled his phone from his pocket. With trembling fingers, he dialed the emergency number for the police, leaving the line open without speaking, silently praying that the police could trace the call. "There, so, tell me, what's the code for the safe at the beach house, Hank?" Nervous shouted, turning his attention back to Thomas. Thomas felt his heart sink. He had no idea. "The code? Well, it's... Hank laughed, a cold, cruel sound. Come on, boss. Don't tell me you've forgotten something so basic." The next few minutes were a nightmare for Thomas. Question after question, he found himself unable to provide the correct answers. Each mistake dug his grave deeper, with the looks from Big Guy and Nervous growing harder and more suspicious. Finally, after a particularly serious mistake, Nervous exploded. "Enough of this nonsense. You're not Hank. You never were." He pointed the gun directly at Thomas's chest, the cold metal gleaming under the dim light of the warehouse. Thomas's heart was racing. He opened his mouth to protest, to plead, to say anything that might save his life. But before he could utter a sound, the warehouse was flooded with a blinding light and the deafening sound of sirens. "Police!" "Everyone stay where you are." In the blink of an eye, the warehouse was swarmed by heavily armed officers. Thomas, Hank, Big Guy, and Nervous were quickly subdued and handcuffed. Amid the chaos, Thomas saw a chance. "Officers, please listen. I'm Thomas Holloway. This man, Hank, he kidnapped me and had my face surgically altered to look like him. I can prove it," he shouted desperately. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Hank began to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of despair or madness, but one of pure, cold satisfaction. "You know what?" "He's right," Hank declared, his face twisting into a macabre smile. "I did it. Lysimixi Hank Morrison kidnapped the illustrious Thomas Holloway and turned him into me. It was the perfect plan, you know. I took a rich and powerful man and turned him into the most wanted criminal in the country. While he was running around trying to prove his innocence, I was free to continue my business without any suspicion. After all, who would look for Hank Morrison when he was supposedly already in custody? It was so easy. A cowardly plastic surgeon, a few loyal henchmen, and I pulled it off. Thomas Holloway's face became mine. I had sent my enemies after him and even alerted the police. If my enemies caught him, I would have been considered dead. If the police caught him, he would have been behind bars in my place. I planned to let him rot in prison for the rest of his life, paying for my crimes. But it seems I underestimated our dear Thomas. He managed to escape and even find me. Impressive, I must admit. But in the end, it doesn't matter. Because even though you know the truth now, you can't undo what's been done. Thomas Holloway will always have my face. He will always carry the mark of what I did to him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my true victory." The silence that followed Hank's confession was heavy, laden with shock and disbelief. Thomas felt a wave of relief mixed with deep exhaustion. Finally, the truth had come to light. In the days that followed, Thomas Holloway's story dominated the headlines. DNA tests confirmed his identity, and Hank Morrison was convicted of his numerous crimes. Once the dust settled, Thomas wasted no time in seeking a solution to his situation. "Nancy, I want my face back. I know it will be a difficult process, but I need to do this," he said, holding his wife's hands. Nancy nodded, understanding. "I'll be by your side every step of the way, Thomas. I'm so sorry, my love, for not recognizing you earlier. I was so confused and scared when you disappeared. I never want to lose you again," she said. Weeks later, Thomas underwent a series of complex plastic surgeries performed by the best surgeons in the country. The process was long and at times painful, but Thomas faced each challenge with determination. Months passed, and gradually, the face he saw in the mirror began to resemble the man he had always been. Nancy was by his side throughout the entire process, her love and support unwavering. Together, they turned this traumatic experience into an opportunity to help other crime victims, establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting people who had gone through similar situations, especially those in need of reconstructive surgery. The day Thomas finally saw himself fully recovered was an emotional one. Looking in the mirror, He saw not just his original face, but also the strength and resilience the ordeal had given him. "It's good to have you back," Nancy smiled, hugging him from behind. Thomas smiled back, feeling truly himself for the first time in a long while. "It's good to be back," he replied. 6 months after Thomas regained his original appearance, the Holloways' lives had settled into a new rhythm. The Saturday morning began like so many others recently. Thomas woke up early, made coffee and brought a cup to Nancy, who was still sleeping. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, placing the cup on the bedside table. Nancy slowly opened her eyes, a smile forming on her lips. "Good morning, Thomas. Ready for the big day?" Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. Today was the official opening of the Holloway Foundation for Crime Victims, a project that had consumed much of his time and resources over the past few months. After breakfast, the couple headed to the city center, where a small building had been renovated to house the foundation. A small crowd had already gathered in front of the building: journalists, local politicians, and most importantly, some of the people the foundation had already begun to help. Thomas adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and approached the podium set up at the entrance. The cameras started flashing as he prepared to speak. "Good morning, everyone," Thomas began, his voice firm and clear. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here today. I went through an ordeal that made me question everything about my identity and my place in the world. But through that experience, I learned a valuable lesson. Our true strength doesn't come from our appearance or social status, but from our resilience and the compassion of those around us." He paused, his eyes meeting Nancy's in the crowd. She smiled encouragingly. "This foundation was born out of that ordeal. Our goal is simple: to offer support, both emotional and practical, to victims of crimes who have had their lives turned upside down. We want to help these people regain not just their physical appearance when needed, but also their confidence and sense of security." Thomas then invited Leah, one of the foundation's first beneficiaries, to the stage. Leah had been the victim of a violent attack that left scars on her face. With the help of the Holloway Foundation, she underwent reconstructive surgeries and therapy. "Leah is just one of many people we hope to help in the coming years," Thomas continued. "Each story is unique, each recovery journey is different, but what they all have in common is the need for support, understanding, and resources to rebuild their lives." After the speech, Thomas and Nancy spent hours talking with those present, listening to stories and sharing their own experiences. When the last guest had left, Thomas found himself alone with Nancy in the foundation's main office. "Are you okay?" Nancy asked, noticing the distant look in her husband's eyes. Thomas smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I'm more than okay. For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do." Nancy kissed him softly. "I'm so proud of you, Thomas. You turned something terrible into something wonderful." As they watched the sunset through the office window, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him there. The emotional scars were still there, but now they served as a reminder not of the trauma, but of the strength he had discovered within himself. "You know, I think I finally understand what it really means to be myself. It's not about the face I see in the mirror, but about the choices I make and the impact I can have on the lives of others," Thomas said softly. Nancy squeezed his hand. "And that's why I love you, Thomas Holloway. Always." Together, they left the office, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, knowing they had found a greater purpose through their ordeal. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We're so grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.